How Not to Weary a Welshman, and Other Success Stories. Chapter 2. The Two-Way Street Paradox, in which Good and Ready, Dinmum's young, chosen family, reviews Dinmum's concise romantic history and explains the two-way street paradox in regard to hard-run sovereignty. Dinmum had tried dating in much the same tentative manner that certain individuals try skiing or snowboarding, and much like those unfortunate winter sports enthusiasts who return from the slopes with severely sprained ankles and an ironclad vow to never strap themselves to a piece of fiberglass again, she had, for all practical intents and purposes, abandoned the enterprise entirely by the time we meet her doing the immigration dance in Chapter 1. Her friends and acquaintances found it unequivocally odd that she remained proverbially single. In fact, when she eventually left her position at a local school to return to university to finish her degree, a widespread rumor circulated that she was relocating for a boyfriend in Chiang Mai. This was a fascinating piece of fiction, considering Dinmum had never physically set foot in Chiang Mai at that point, let alone possessed an acquaintance of any romantic configuration there. She had simply been solo for years. The few times she had actively or briefly attempted the dating ritual, the logistics had gone awry far too spectacularly to justify the energy expenditure. As a close friend had once astutely summarized, she does not do stuff that is vastly uncomfortable, and initially dating is usually vastly uncomfortable, ergo she does not date. While this diagnosis was perhaps an oversimplification, it was empirically accurate. Dinmum had spent the entire first 30 years of her life existing in a state of extreme prolonged uncomfortability, not related to dating, but to AWOL family situations. Having finally escaped that systematic reality, she saw absolutely no logical point in continuing down that particular rut once she was free to choose a different path. Her peace was a sovereign territory, and she had no intention of letting a doofus cross the border. Dating was, in Dinmum's documented experience, an incredibly arduous affair filled with humans who became steadily more doofy the longer you were around them, not less so. By the point in time we meet her at the immigration counter, her historical data pool was remarkably concise. She had dated precisely 5 people in the whole of her life. Not a single one of these trial ones had managed to survive past the 3-date mark or a duration of longer than 4 weeks. Granted, in every single case, it was Dinmum who had politely yet firmly declined all future outings. She had been forced to conclude, with a sort of detached clinical clarity, that she had apparently viewed the entire concept of human relationships, romantically speaking, far differently than the vast majority of the population. Dinmum was not a picky person in the least when it came to the initial decision to date. She simply possessed a vastly different paradigm than the public square. She found that while she chose to date people for who she genuinely believed them to be, which admittedly was sometimes an idealized hologram they projected rather than the reality, most people seemed to date for what they thought they could turn a person into. It never naturally occurred to Dinmum to demand that someone alter their fundamental architecture. She liked people as they were. If she discovered she didn't like people as they were, she preferred to freely dissolve the situation rather than embark on a campaign to remodel their personality. Unfortunately, this respect for personal borders was rarely mutual. In her brief excursions into the dating pool, she discovered that by the second or third outing, most men invariably demanded 2 things. First, they wanted a firm guarantee of biological children. This was a concept that had never been a central directive for Dinmum. Frankly, the idea of producing a miniature her was a bit off-putting. One of her was indeed quite enough, sometimes even a bit too much, logistically speaking. Second, they demanded an explicit timeline for physical intimacy. Because Dimum operated on a gray sexual frequency, she honestly could not provide them with a definitive schedule. It wasn't a matter of tactical hedging or playing games. Intimacy simply did not occupy space in her frontal lobe the way it seemed to take up for most. The reality was that it was so aggressively present in other parties invariably left her feeling deeply uncomfortable and structurally inadequate or ill-matched. Intellectually, she understood that being gray sexual was not a defect to be corrected, it was simply a baseline setting. just as being allosexual was a baseline setting for others. There was nothing inherently wrong with either orientation. The systematic error only occurred when an individual of one frequency began demanding outputs from someone of a completely different frequency that were mathematically and emotionally impossible to deliver. In the sparse collection of dates she had experienced, a predictable pattern invariably emerged. The other party would routinely declare how much they admired her strength, her absolute independence, and her quiet drive. They would then state with a staggering lack of awareness that they were willing to settle for her based on these traits, despite their voiced disappointment regarding her gray sexuality and her complete inability to promise them biological heirs. They would also invariably and grumpily complain that they didn't understand why she was even with them, since she clearly didn't need them for anything. In making this accusation, they conveniently forgot the one or two instances when she actually had asked for a basic courtesy, such as picking her up for a date because they were already nearby. Yet when they proved entirely unable to arrive within a 40-minute window, she logically concluded it was best not to rely on them. The failure of proving dependable led to an independence loop. It reinforced Dimum's belief that independence was a necessity, even or especially in a relationship. It also reinforced her ex's belief that if she could just handle everything on her own, so why bother? Bugger it. However, this independence loop was inevitably structured into the two-way street paradox. If a partnership could not function as a two-way street where one could depend on a person the way they obviously came to depend on you, then it didn't need to be a street at all, did it? It was at this exact juncture in the conversation, when the two-way street paradox arose, that Dimum's Crawley-like precision would quietly take the wheel. She would politely, elegantly walk away. Her parting thesis was always simple. No one in this life should ever have to settle. She genuinely wished the other party the absolute best, harboring a sincere hope that they would find precisely the configuration of person they were looking for elsewhere. Din Mum firmly believed that we should never choose a partner out of codependent necessity. One should not build a life for someone because they need them, or because the other person needs to be rescued. Rather, a true partnership should exist solely because two people want to be together so much more than they want to be apart, to such a degree that the alternative becomes a nearly impossible to fathom. Furthermore, she held an ironclad rule that a union must actively make the world a better, more luminous place than it would be if both parties remained separate, because if that is not the case, what the bloody hell is the point? Thus, by fiercely refusing to become someone else's compromise, she was seamlessly refused to compromise her own hard-won sovereignty. Her intent was typically altruistic, wishing the best for the other human, but the structural byproduct was a flawless, unshakable defense of her own peace. It left her life entirely intact, even if a bit lonely, while the other parties were left utterly baffled. They simply couldn't fathom a woman who refused to let them shape her into their ideal, or at the very least bear them half a dozen children while maintaining 3 jobs over a span of a decade. Women and their damn independence. The very idea. You offer them the world, or at least half a dozen children within a set time frame, and they decline. Unconscionable.